Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise tonight in adjournment proceedings to pursue a question that I asked on a very memorable day. It was April 12th of this spring, and we were here gathered just hours after this place was electrified by the inspiring speech of Malala Yousafzai. She was extraordinary. I think we all remember her ability, her deft touch of humor, her compelling life story, and her challenge to Canada to help and make a priority in the education of women and girls. Now, at that time, I asked a question in question period of the Prime Minister and used the challenge that Malala Yousafzai had put to us. We'll recall that her address laid out very clearly the case, the absolutely rock-solid case that educating women and girls is the best investment one can make in peace and security and bettering the whole world. As she said, secondary education for girls can transform our countries, our communities, and the whole world. But, she went on, around the world, 130 million girls are out of school today. Well, her challenge to the Prime Minister is one, and actually she stated it as, "Dear Canada, I ask you to lead again," and she had very specific questions. Will the Prime Minister make girls' education the central theme of his upcoming G7 presidency? Will he use the influence of Canada to help fill the global education funding gap? Will Canada offer to host the upcoming replenishment of the Global Partnership for Education? Will Canada prioritize 12 years of school for every refugee child? And I have to say the Prime Minister's answer was entirely positive, but as in the case with many answers in question period, it lacked specificity. Clearly, the Prime Minister spoke of the enormous honour of welcoming Malala Yousafzai. He agreed that we need to do more, and he agreed that in Canada's G7 presidency, which will begin next year, there will be a strong emphasis on gender equality and opportunity for women and girls. But since that time, I think that we can say quite fairly, and unfortunately, the world has fallen short, and there have been a number of disturbing developments. Again, one of these things still lies in the future, which is the G7 presidency for Canada. But the G7 meeting just months later, in June of this year in Italy, was extremely disappointing. A much-anticipated report on education was shelved. Malala Yousafzai and her supporters, the Malala Fund, within 48 hours, generated more than 27,000 allies and individuals who mobilized in 134 countries demanding that the report be released. It was not. Meanwhile, funding for women and girls for their education has dropped, particularly large funders. I will identify the United States and the United Kingdom particularly, have reduced their funding. So there's now less funding to meet this critical sustainable development goal for education than there was when just a year ago. So the question is this, and another thing that was very specific in the challenge was, would Canada step up to host the global replenishment? No, it was Senegal and France that stepped up. So this is not a failure. This is not a broken promise, not yet. But I ask the government, I ask the Prime Minister, I ask the Parliamentary Secretary, will Canada step up and deliver on the promises that we made to Malala?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of International Development.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank my honourable colleague for a question. But if you would permit me before I begin, I was to attend a toast to the late Jim Flaherty from my riding of Whitby this evening in support of the Ability Centre, a project which he and his wife Christine really worked hard to ensure came to fruition. So I do want at this point to raise a toast from this venue to the late Jim Flaherty in honor of his work on the Ability Center. Mr. Speaker, to answer my honorable colleague's question, we believe that every girl and boy should be able to go to school and complete primary and secondary education regardless of their circumstance or refugee status. This is in line with Canada's commitment to the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development adopted by the United Nations in 2015. We also believe that gender equality, the empowerment of women and girls, and the promotion of human rights are key Canadian values. Canada integrates attention to gender equality into all issues of development programming and reduces barriers to girls' education. We are providing community-based education, training to teachers to address gender discrimination, and preventing gender-based violence in schools. Canada is also working to end child, early, and forced marriage, and to meet girls' water, sanitation, and hygiene needs by providing $7.5 million to UNICEF for the Wins for Girls initiative. And of course, these initiatives emphasize our holistic approach to education because you can't study or do well in school without addressing issues like these. Canada also supports increased access to education for girls, including in Kenya and Pakistan, as well as for Syrian refugees, girls in Lebanon and Jordan. Canada is supporting a multi-donor initiative to meet the government of Jordan's commitment to ensure that girls and boys, including refugees, have access to public school. In addition to supporting girls' education, Canada is concerned about the gaps in education for crisis-affected children and refugees. We are providing $20 million to the Education Cannot Wait Fund for emergency education. Under the new Middle East strategy between 2016 and 2019, our government has so far committed $180 million to education initiatives for children affected by the Syria and Iraq crises. In addition, Canada is providing $120 million to the Global Partnership for Education to strengthen education systems in 65 developing countries, and actively participating in board, committees, and supporting their work on a country level. With respect to our work to address the education funding gap in developing countries, Canada was engaging with our G7 partners on the G7 Toromia Progress Report, which will demonstrate Canada's meaningful progress on education. This includes progress in areas where education outcomes have a direct impact on gender equality, health, inclusive growth, and peace and security. While it is too early to specify what themes Canada will prioritize next year during its G7 presidency, we certainly will build on efforts to strengthen gender equality and women's empowerment, which cannot be achieved without education. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
Thank you to my friend, Parliamentary Secretary. I join her in a toast to Jim Flaherty and thank Christine for their work for the Ability Center. What we're looking at in terms of the education of women and girls is and remains urgent. I know we share a lot of the concerns in this place about that issue, but just to give this House a sense of the scale, $20 million from Canada for the Education Cannot Wait Fund aims to raise $3.85 billion. So we've donated essentially a drop in the bucket. We can do better. We have $120 million to the Global Partnership and Education Replenishment Campaign. The gap is huge. It needs to raise $3.1 billion for the period 2018 to 2020. I know these are challenging things. There are multiple priorities that press on a government. But Malala Yousafzai is a Canadian citizen. I want her to be proud of her country. I want us to lead.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And to my honourable colleague, we both agree that the gap is huge. And as I mentioned in my speech, we are taking a holistic approach to ensuring that girls and boys have the education they need within crises and conflict and fragile zones. But, Mr. Speaker, with our new Feminist International Assistance Policy, we are taking a comprehensive approach in ensuring that we're listening to local actors, that we're allowing for programming that listens to women and girls who are on the ground, to ensure that once we make those investments in education, that things like water and sanitation that also impact whether or not a girl could go to school and effectively thrive in that environment, whether a girl could reach her full potential because she doesn't have the other acts of violence towards her. We want to make sure that we are looking at this comprehensively to ensure that girls can grow and reach their full potential.